Welcome to the Learner Centered Collaborative Podcast. I'm your host, Katie Martin, and so thrilled to invite you to my conversation with Bryanna Hanson, our learning experience designer here at LCC. She has been a high school and middle school Spanish teacher where she taught in a competency-based micro school and has supported schools across the country in their own competency-based journey. Bryanna is integral to our work here at LCC and with partners and has been working on a competency-based playbook, which we're going to talk about today. Welcome, Bryanna.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. I'm excited to be here.
All right, so let's start with the background. Can you share some of the experiences that have shaped you as the educational leader that you are today?
Yeah, so I think, my story, like many people, start when I'm little. I loved school. Going to school was always fun for me, even when I was older. But my first day of kindergarten, I came home crying because the teacher had not assigned me homework and demanded that my mom give me homework. So that was kind of, a glimpse into what school was like for me. I really loved it. And I took all of the advanced courses, and my goal was to get into a good college, and I got generally straight A's. And I would say that like the system of school worked for me. It was something that I was good at and something that I succeeded in. And I didn't really start questioning what that experience was like until I got older. I went to college and I studied abroad in Spain, and I had gotten straight A's in Spanish class. So I thought, I even remember on the plane, like, I got this, like, I am gonna crush this study abroad experience, and I know so much Spanish. And I was sitting there studying my like vocabulary and grammar tests that I had taken and gotten these straight A's on. And I was so excited. I get there, my host mom picks me up, and I realize I have no idea how to communicate with her. Like, I just don't even know. She's asking me about myself and my family, and I'm like listing this vocabulary. Like, do you want me to tell you about the preterite? Like, let me tell you about that tense. But I had no idea how to like have a conversation with her. And so that experience was really enlightening for me. I left fluent in Spanish from this like really authentic learning experience, both in classes, but also in this home environment and in making friends. And I decided that I kind of always knew I wanted to be a teacher, but I decided I wanted to be a Spanish teacher because I wanted to change that experience for my students. I realized like I was getting all these A's, but I wasn't able to do anything with what I was learning. So I wanted to create a learning experience for my students that was more authentic. And so, fast forward to my first year teaching, again, this like overconfidence. I like had a master's degree in teaching. I had done my student teaching. I thought, I've got this. I know exactly what I'm doing. And which, is hilarious to anyone who's been a teacher, that someone would think that on the first day. And I walk in and they're like, okay, so here's your SIS. Let's get you logged in, and you need to set up a grade book and get some grades in the first week of school. I'm like, what are you talking about? Set up my grade book. I have no idea what does that even entail. I've like graded in a system in my student teaching, but we never talked about this in school. I didn't learn how to set up a grade book or even really grade. And so they're like, well, you need to decide, how you're going to weight things. If your tests are going to be more than quizzes, or are you going to use points or percentages? I'm like, well, what's the best thing to do? They're like, oh, well, everyone does it differently. So, just find out. So I started talking to different teachers in my department, and I just picked one, I think, and went with it. That same week, they give me the curriculum. They're like, here's the textbook, and here's the tests and the quizzes. And I thought, wait a minute. This isn't what I wanted. I wanted to create these authentic projects, and I want my students to really be using the language. I don't want to recreate these tests and quizzes that I had that really got me nowhere in the language. And they said, well, no, this is the tests and the quiz that you give, and this is the curriculum, and you just go with it. And you can add a project on if you want. That's, that would be fun. So then like, thinking back on it now, I don't think I was as surprised in the moment, but like I'm shocked to think about like the tests and the quizzes, we all had to give the same thing,
Right.
but how we graded those tests and quizzes could be completely up to us. And I really did not understand that. I didn't know anything about best practices, and there's a lot of research out there, and I had not read it. I didn't know anything about it going into teaching. But as you mentioned, I later had the opportunity to work in a micro school that was really focused on student agency and project-based learning, and it had all of the kind of things that modeled my philosophy of what I wanted my classroom to look like. And there were no grades. So again, I walked into the system and it aligned philosophically to what I wanted, but I had no idea what I was doing. And I didn't know, okay, now I need to assess in a completely different way. I can't give points as kind of the carrot to like doing things. So what does that look like? And so I really shifted my assessment practices in that world. And I think the thing that I walked away with from that was really the conversations I had with students started to shift. It wasn't about how can I get the extra credit, or how do I study for this final that I have to take, to really being about how do I speak more Spanish? How do I could I practice my listening more to make sure that I can understand more words? It was really about the learning and not about compliance. And I think all of that makes me reflect back on my experience. I mentioned that the system worked for me and I did really well in it. But what did I learn in BC calculus class? Like what was that really? I did that because I was told that would be what would get me into college.
Right.
I don't remember anything from that class. I wish I had taken statistics. I could use that a lot more in my life right now. But I think that's really what it's made me reflect on, is that I was good at playing the game of school, but I don't really know what I really learned from it. And so my purpose now is really supporting schools in shifting that, so students really do have that experience that I got to have with my students in my competency-based learner-centered classroom. That was really about how do we learn and grow as humans, and less about how do we like check the boxes and do what we're told to do.
I love that your story just brought up so many like visualizations for me as you were talking about like your first year as a teacher and having to put grades in the grade book. Well, your SIS. I was
Yeah.
thinking about my grade book because back in my day, before they had the grading platforms, you were writing it in a book and doing the average. And you're right, like no one said, here's what you should do. The focus was on the curriculum and the test, but no one talked about how we graded that. And my teacher education program, which was great, still never focused on that. I didn't get into grades or even the philosophy of it until my master's or PhD. And that means a lot of teachers don't even have those conversations. They just do what someone else is doing or what they think is right instead of actually understanding how grades really impact students and really impact their trajectory too.
Absolutely. I mean, we would have these meetings that year too around like, well, what grade does this student have? And how can we support them? But it was never like, what does that grade mean? Like it was just a given that this was
Right.
how people were grading, even though everybody was grading differently. And it's just, but we all give the same tests. So
Right. Well, and then those grades, for better or worse, people do, use them as their identity sometimes. Oh, you're a good student, and
that
you'll
was
get
me. I did. My identity was wrapped around the fact that I got straight A's. And that was something that I look back on and I wish I had a different experience in school, even though it was successful for me.
right. And the same way, I didn't get straight A's, so I was like, well, I'm not good at school. I'm not even going to try. Like I have B's, I'm just average. It was just something unattainable to really push myself because I hadn't gotten those A's. And then I had friends who C's or and they were like, "Oh, I'm not good at school. I'm just gonna not take part." And often teachers think that their grades mean something different or they have a different conception of what they are, but they're different maybe than their peer next door.
Mhm.
So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. What are some of the challenges? You've done a ton of research, you've done this in your own classroom. We talk about this all the time. What are some of the challenges that we want to name for people about with traditional grades?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of them is there's been a lot of talk about the danger of a zero, or what a zero can do. There's this idea that the 0 to 100 point scale, and with an A to F, it's really skewed to failure. Like we say like 60% is failure. And if a student gets a 0 in their grade book, it really tanks their grade. And we never talk about that. I mean, I gave 0s to my students that those first years teaching in a traditionally graded system. And it was because the student didn't turn something in. But really that skews the students towards failure, and it also focuses on turning something in on time more than it focuses on actually doing the learning. And so I think one of the biggest things is the system is skewed towards failure and skewed towards students not doing as well as they could if they get a 0 anywhere in their kind of semester or their journey. And I think the other one is a myth of objectivity that happens with a 0 to 100 points or percentages. There's this idea that if I can give an 87% instead of an 84%, that really clearly shows that the student did better than the 84. We can kind of rank students in terms of, an 87% versus an 84%. But one, there's been a lot of studies that have shown that the same student work is assessed by different teachers on the same rubric in completely different ways, from like, somewhere around 60 points to somewhere around 90 points. Like just there's not objectivity with these points. And you can really, how do you define 84 versus 87? It gets really like splitting hairs.
Well, yes, and I've also done read some research that teachers' moods impact how they grade. And
Yes.
of course, that feels like no way, I'm very objective and here's my rubric, or I'm gonna grade it using this scale. But we have a lot of factors that influence how we grade something, time of day, how we're feeling, what we think about the student, all of those influence that. And then when you're talking about the objectivity, like we really put students like an 89% is a B,
Right.
right? And then 90%, like that 1 percentage point
Totally
can make the
changes.
difference between a 4.0 and a B average.
Well, and
And
not even everywhere, right? Like some systems, a 90 is an A, and in some systems, you have to have a 94 to have an A. And it might be an A minus or a B plus, or, it's completely different
yeah.
within a school district, within a school. It can be varied based on the teacher, which is also, going back to like me not knowing how to set up my grade book. Every teacher is doing this differently and can have different scales and different ways that they are calculating grades.
Well, I've mentioned to you as a parent, when I look at my kids' grade scales, there are 6 classes and there are 6 different grading scales. So in one class, an A goes all the way down to an 80%. In another class, it's a 90. In another one class, it's a 6 point scale. Another class, it's a 4 point scale. Another class, it's a 100 point scale. It's confusing for me as a parent, but like, what does that say to kids when
Mhm.
they're trying to make sense of like their grades? They, between teachers, they have to play such different games.
Yeah, absolutely. And every teacher just does it in a different way. You have to learn all of the different kind of ways to understand it, and you don't. There's no way you can understand all of those different systems.
So, all right, so we talked about the myth of objectivity. We talked about the 100 point scale and the 0. What other challenges do we see with traditional grades?
I think the one that we talk often about is just that you don't know what an 87% means. I think Thomas Geske tells us like the omnibus grade, like this idea that an 87% could be because you didn't turn all your homework in, or it could be that you didn't do well on the tests. But the same two different students with an 87% could be for completely different reasons. So if you're just looking at a transcript of, oh, this student has a B, you have no idea what that student can do. And then I think even going beyond that, like, what did my A in Spanish class mean? It meant I turned all my homework in and I got the test on all this grammar and vocabulary, but that made me feel confident. That made me feel like I knew Spanish, and I did not. So, just like, what does that grade mean? There's so much of a
Mhm.
black box of what goes into that grade, even with a transparent SIS system. And I think that's, to me, that's one of the biggest issues, is that it just means nothing.
All right. So if I'm a teacher right now listening, I'm like, might be thinking, oh my gosh, I've been feeling that way for so long. That totally makes sense to me. I might also be feeling like, ooh, that's really scary because I hold a lot of weight and, I put a lot behind my grades and I feel like I put a lot of work into them, right? Like I know a lot of teachers, myself included, like I took it very seriously because I really cared about my kids. I mean, not the saying all teachers don't, but I really wanted their grades to mean something to them. So I would write all this feedback on their essays. I
Mhm.
would really like pay attention to the rubric and make sure I was down to that like nth point. Um, and then give it back to them, and they may or may not care, but I really put a lot of effort into it. And I know there's a lot of teachers putting a lot of effort into their grades, taking a lot of work home with them, spending weekends grading. And to hear that it might not be accurately representing what kids know and can do might also feel really frustrating, right? So we want to just acknowledge that
Yeah.
like this is a challenge in our system. And so our goal is to unearth some of these traditional challenges with grades, and then talk about what else is possible and really think about how we can move to more of a competency-based system that does help young people know what they know and can do, but also help educators be really clear and support them on that journey. And then
Yeah.
also bring parents in too in a way that is really meaningful.
Absolutely. And I was that teacher too. And I look back, especially as I've done more research recently, even, I can see that even in my competency-based system, I could have done things better. And I think that's, how we are as educators, is we always want to be improving, but also know that, I did the best that I knew how to do in that moment. And I tried, like you said, really hard to make sure that my grades were representative. And I did a lot of feedback. And I think what it ultimately comes down to is students are paying, I would get frustrated with my students. Like, you don't want to look at my feedback. You don't want to talk about learning, but it's not actually the students. Like, I was unwittingly and totally unknowingly holding this system up that was making my students focus on the points and the grades. Like, and I was frustrated with them, but really it was the system. And I was just part of this system in that moment.
So I want you to kind of highlight the example because I think this concrete example from your Spanish class and your food truck project can help people understand that difference. So can you share a little bit about your food truck project and how your grading and philosophy evolved over two different times doing the project?
Yeah, so I was in this kind of traditional grading system. We had the traditional quizzes and tests, and I was able to kind of do projects as like a fun add-on to the unit. And I thought, well, we have this food unit. Let's do a fun food truck. Students will research a Spanish-speaking country. They'll create a food truck. They'll have to create a menu, and they'll present it to the class. So they did this project, and I created a rubric. And the rubric was things like, speaking in Spanish, and did you do the research, and did you have all the components that were required? And I gave them, it was a group project. I gave them all kind of the same grade on the same rubric for presenting the food truck to the class. And it was fun. Kids loved it, and it was really exciting. When I was teaching in the middle school micro school, I thought, well, that was a really fun project. I'm gonna bring that to these kids. But we went bigger. We had exhibitions of learning at the school. And so we decided to do it as an exhibition where parents would come in, students, community members. We would actually cook the food. The students would create the food truck. So I did a provocation. I came in and I made my own food truck, and we all in Spanish ordered, and we did this whole experience. And then I said, you guys are going to do the same thing. What do you want it to look like? What do you want to include? And so we co-created a checklist of what it would be to really create this food truck. We talked about, well, what do we need to learn? Oh, we need to learn a lot about menus in Spanish speaking countries. We need to learn about food. We need to learn all these things. So we started learning, and we started doing research together. And they made their food trucks, and we had this amazing experience. They made these really beautiful, posters. I mean, they went all out in a way that my high school students who were getting a grade on it did not go all out. And that's what I love about middle school kids. But they didn't get a grade. They didn't get any assessment for that project. They went and did this amazing exhibition of learning and learned so much in the process, but they were not given a grade on the food truck itself. And that's that shift from like the assignment or the product to the learning. In the first example, my students were given a grade on the product, on the food truck itself and their presentation. But what happened in the competency-based world in which I was assessing is that students got a speaking grade or assessment, right? Score. I asked them to show me how they would order in Spanish at the food trucks. And I had them do it while they were practicing for the food truck. So I didn't have them do it at the exhibition. And they actually came up to me and they did their speaking, and I would give them, here's where you are on the proficiency levels. And if they didn't like it, they'd say, find me during the exhibition tomorrow and I'll show you I can do it again, and they would do it better the next day, and I'd give them, that would be the assessment score I would give them. They did a writing assessment where they wrote after the exhibition, they wrote a review of the food trucks that they ate at the day before. And some of those students wrote in really simple words because their proficiency level was really low. And that was great for them. That was like their level. Whereas other students were writing sentences about what they ate and why they chose that food on the menu. And so I gave them assessments. They were assessed on their learning, but they were not assessed on the food truck. The food truck was the vehicle to get to that learning. And I think that was the biggest shift in my classroom. And I talked about the shift towards students talking about the learning. They were asking me, well, I want to say this in my review. And we were learning about new words. Whereas in the first system, it was really more about like, let me just check all the boxes and like do this presentation. And I didn't really assess them on their Spanish. I was assessing them on their food truck. It doesn't even make sense really when I think about it that way. But that was kind of my journey in transitioning to a competency-based system. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me is really it's about what is the learning that you want students to do and focus on that rather than the product of what that looks like or the test or the assessment. It's really more about the outcome.
Yeah. And what I hear, those experiences and opportunities to understand what kids know and can do. That's the assessment, right?
Mhm.
I have a conversation with you. I overhear you talking to a peer. I see your writing. I see you revising it to get better, right? Engaging in that's the whole goal of knowing another, well, a big goal of knowing another language is to communicate with somebody.
Right.
Um, and so often it's one dimensional, and many of our grading systems look that way. So I love that example of really moving from assessing the food truck, which some people will be like, oh my gosh, that is a really cool project. That's a huge shift, even from many just traditional assignments. But even that is, you were assessing the project instead of really assessing the learners. And then the motivation that you highlighted that comes from that when they really truly are learning something, they're seeing the benefit of it and having fun. That is so possible and so exciting because we see those things happening more and more across the country. And that's why I'm just so excited to highlight these practices and give people the permission to do what I think a lot of teachers feel like, oh, that makes sense to me. Of course, that's how I want to do it, right? So to give that permission to lean into what we know about learning and how to help kids demonstrate what they know and can do.
Yeah, and I think it also, it shows the authentic audience piece of like really it was all about people were going to come in and see your food truck and they were excited about that. And so I think that also highlights that a competency-based system doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens with authentic learning, personalized learning. It happens with focusing on relationships and social emotional, like it doesn't just happen and you just flip it. Even thinking about redesigning a report card, like redesigning a report card itself does not shift anything. It is the way that you are reporting learning, and it does start to create waves and shifts, but all these other things in the system also need to change in order to support that new report card. I think that's something that is important to call out too.
Yeah. There's a lot of technical shifts in grading and assessing that we can shift. You can shift the report card, you can shift from letters to numbers, but if you don't change your mindset, you don't change your assessments, you don't change what the learning experience looks like, we're not actually going to get to that full experience of what is possible.
Absolutely.
So I want to shift a little bit as you've been doing this research and you've been talking to schools. You've highlighted many of the opportunities in different ways that systems are approaching their competency-based learning journey. What are some needs that you're seeing as you talk with these school leaders? What's coming up for you that needs to be addressed?
I think one is that the ones who have done it successfully have really shifted a lot of the other systems that I was just mentioning. Like they make sure that their teachers have collaboration time. They make sure that there's professional learning time focused to this. There's a lot of communication that happens with families. So I think really thinking about all the enabling conditions that make a shift possible is really crucial. I also think those who are struggling more are struggling for a few reasons. One is technology. There are not a lot of technology tools that do this. Our current systems are set up for traditional grading. And even though they may have some different models, it's still in that kind of traditional paradigm. And so there's a need for new technologies, and there are a lot of really great new technologies that are coming out. But that's a big need, is like the actual how we do this. 'Cause a lot of systems are also doing it in really low tech and manual ways, which is challenging at scale.
Yeah, a lot of effort for
Yes.
educators. Yeah, and like you said, challenging at scale.
Absolutely. And then I think another piece is really getting clear on those outcomes. I was just working with a teacher in this kind of paradigm shift, and we were looking at an assessment she was doing, and she was like, this rubric actually isn't actually assessing what I want it to assess. And just really, I think it just takes some real time for people to unpack, like, what is the thing I'm assessing? It took me a really long time to unpack that first rubric in the food truck was assessing the food truck and not the learning. I thought it was assessing the learning. And just really unpacking, like, what am I really assessing, and why am I assessing it, and how am I assessing it, and is that way I'm assessing it actually match? So I think taking a lot of time to focus on the outcomes. Those systems who are finding a lot of success in a competency-based learning model have taken that time, and I think that's really crucial.
Yeah, and then bringing students in. When you were talking about your example, that one of the big shifts that you highlighted was that you asked students, here's the end goal. What do
Mhm.
you want it to look like? What do we need to learn? And a lot of people are fearful, like, well, kids don't know how we might not get to it. It doesn't mean everything they say is the only way, but bringing in students for their input and getting them excited about what they need to learn is a great strategy. And if they aren't clear on what they're supposed to learn, it's going to be really hard to get them there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we spent a lot of time making meaning of the rubrics and really thinking about what it meant to be proficient in different areas.
All right, so there's some shifts to a lot of places moving away from traditional grades. You mentioned the zero, and so there's a lot of standards-based systems that are doing that, and alternative grading systems. But then competency-based is a little bit different as well. So can we talk about what is the difference between a traditional grading system, a standards-based grading system, and then a competency-based system?
Yeah, I mean, I think these words get thrown around, and they can easily be referred to multiple things. I like to think about it. Traditional system is pretty clear to define, right? It's like a 0 to 100 points, percentages, A to F grades. The focus is on giving these points. There's a lot of systems that are moving to, I think we've called them alternative grading systems. Like, you're still using the points, some form of points, some form of percentages, or you have some sort of like final grade, but you're really trying to focus that on learning. Maybe you're separating academics and habits. Maybe you're dropping zeros. There's a lot of systems out there that are trying to do some of those things to make grades more equitable and to make grading more clear. I think that is still living in a kind of traditional grading paradigm. And a lot of that is due to, we have to submit grades to the state, or we have to submit grades for students to get into college. There are people who are trying to shift that paradigm. And one of those is standards-based grading and reporting. So that's really going usually on a 0 to 4, or sorry, a 1 to 4 scoring scale or proficiency scale, and you're using the state standards to give assessments in your ELA class or in your math class, and reporting out on those standards in a 1 to 4 scale. And then beyond that is competency-based assessment and reporting, which is really, the shift there is more on less on discrete content-based standards and more on these bigger grain size competencies that also include kind of whole learner outcomes, like we call them at LCC. Things like critical thinking and collaboration and SEL skills, like these things that we want to build in learners, but that are not siloed into your ELA class. They're, really interdisciplinary. And so there are systems that are assessing those competencies in an interdisciplinary way across courses and then reporting out on those. So I think those are kind of the big differences between some of the ways that people are going about shifting away from this traditional grading system.
Yeah, and I am glad you pointed out that these words are used interchangeably sometimes, but that's kind of a framing for our thinking at LCC. And the way I think about it is the standards-based system is very vertical, right? You go really deep. Like you take one standard that might be about, finding the main idea. I'm a language arts teacher, so I always go back to like finding the main idea or being able to infer. And you take that one standard and you break it down into what it looks like at a 1, 2, 3, and 4 level. And then you're always, that's still getting to that granularity of like, well, did they do it a little bit or a lot, or did they exceed? So that's where we get into the like 2s and 3s, and sometimes people are doing 2.5. The challenge I see here in this standards-based system is that one, there seems to be a disconnect between the 3 and the 4. And I see many educators who take the 3 as meeting expectations. And that's kind of what Marzano and people say, like the 3 is meeting expectations. Well, for some teachers, they say, I only teach to a 3. I only teach to meet expectations, and you have to go above and beyond. And so some experiences, like if you're in 8th grade, you have to be at an 11th grade level to get the 4, right? Where some teachers say, I teach that in my classroom, and I give you those opportunities to go above and beyond, and so you can earn the 4 in my class. And then the challenge is when we translate those to grades. So we get back to that traditional problem of the difference between an A and a B. And so even in this standards-based system, we're really not clear on what it means to be proficient, and therefore what it is to get a B or to get an A. And we're still creating this inequity amongst our grading systems and what it means for students. And just on a really narrow level, we're still taking behavior out of this a lot because we're just focusing on the standard, but still that clarity of what it means is not always there, and not always equal across people in a system, let alone across the country.
Well, I think what you brought up is this issue of there are a lot of systems trying to do standards-based or competency-based learning that still have to translate back to a grade for these kind of outside reasons and these systemic reasons. And when you try to take those two paradigms and like mix them together, there's just a lot of challenge in that translation. And the whole point of really moving towards proficiency, towards mastery, whatever you want to call it, is really to think about how am I growing, not how am I getting an A and ranking against other students. That's not the point, but when we translate it back, that becomes the point. And so therefore you look at a 4 and you see an A, and you look at a 3 and you see a B, and that's it. Nothing has changed. We're just focusing on learning a little bit more than we're taking that kind of question of like, what does the B mean, at least a little bit out of it. So there's that, but I think it's muddying the waters.
Yeah. Well, and in some systems, when teachers aren't part of those discussions, they just hear we're changing from A's to numbers, like letters to numbers. They're like, okay. And then I think that's where people say parents don't want to be, they're like so confused and they don't want to be part of this because they also don't understand what's happening. If we're just all of a sudden, I went from an A to F system to a 1 to 4. What does that really mean? So, and then competency based, when we're really looking, I think of that as much more horizontal, right? So they're bigger grain size, like you said, and we're saying like, this is what it looks like at this level. and you either meet it or don't, and then you go to the next level, right? Trying to be the
Huge
clarity,
shift. Yes.
right? The clarity of like, this is what it means to meet, and you either are there or you're not, or you haven't shown enough evidence, right? So that's the, well, I didn't turn in my work. Well, I don't have enough evidence to know if you've met this or not. So we're not there yet. But then we just keep working on it. Doesn't mean you have to do it on Tuesday because that's when the test is. It means here's the clarity of what we're trying to accomplish. And your work, your evidence should demonstrate that you can. I was just in Mineola, one of the schools we talk about a lot, and there was a third grade teacher sitting on the ground with four students, and they were defending their learning and they to move to that next level. They knew what the criteria was. They were showing their body of work, their evidence. And she was saying, great, you got it. Or go back and fix this. We need more work. Come back and show me again. So it's those structures can exist in our traditional systems. It's just a way of thinking about what is the criteria for what it means to be at that level. And do we want to go really deep on a narrow standard, or do we want to be clear across these competencies what we want kids to know and do?
Yeah, I think that's really the biggest shift to a competency-based system is this kind of progression, or some systems call them continua, where you're really looking at the same competency following a student from when they're 5 years old to when they're 18 years old, and how are they growing over time. People always say they want to see growth over time, but it's really hard to do in a standards-based system because standards are discrete grade level content area standards. And yeah, there are similar standards that kind of grow with you, but that's not how the system is structured. And so in a competency-based system, you can really start to see, like you said, students grow up the levels as they grow. And it's not this student is at the ninth grade level. It's like this student is at level whatever, and they might be at that level in sixth grade. They might be at that level in 10th grade. And that follows like learning research. We know that students do not all follow the exact same pattern of like every student in ninth grade exactly can do XYZ. And so that's really that paradigm shift around like growing with the learner, the competency over time. And then you get rid of that issue with the 4 points, because you don't need a 4. A 4 is just saying you're on to the next level. I think that's the biggest thing about in a standards-based system. When you have a 4, doesn't that just mean the student is actually meeting the next standard? And so I think that's what I love about a competency-based progression is we don't even have that issue. You can just say, well, the student is at the next level, and whether that's, maybe that's above grade level expectations, if you will, but that's great. They're at the next level, and maybe they're not. And you can still show growth as they continue to move up those levels.
Yeah. And we've seen systems that still, because we have, transcripts and we have to give grades, many places say the grade is all you have to give. They don't define, as we've mentioned, how you get to that grade.
Yes.
So you can have a competency-based system and look at here's the level you need to get to an A, here's the level you need to get a B, and you can define that really clearly for students and still create that system, and then at the end have a grade to put in the grade book or wherever it needs to go.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Mineola, they have this built out for their high school synergy. We'll be featuring them in the competency-based reporting playbook and how they've been able to do that, really focus on student learning in a standards-based way and then translate that to a grade. We've been talking with Waukesha East Academy, which is doing this in a totally different way and looking at competencies and really defining how you get a C, a B, or an A in their system. So there are a lot of ways to then translate back, but there's also a lot of systems really pushing the envelope and rethinking the statement, we have to translate to grades, or we have to have a transcript for colleges. And so it's really exciting to see lots of different systems trying different things and finding a lot of success. And that's what we're hoping in the playbook to really highlight for people.
So, that this last week I was at the Carnegie Summit, and we were presenting on a new report card. So Encinitas Union is redesigning their report card, and we were presenting on that. And we had a really great group of people coming to talk about their dislike of their dissatisfaction with their report cards, and then also share some examples. But one of the conversations that popped up is one of the attendees was using Mastery Transcript.
Yeah.
And mastery transcript, they, are able to have the competencies and show evidence and how students have their jagged profiles, and where they're strong and areas in which they are continuing to grow or have opportunities. And then there's a portfolio that they can add their work. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's cool. But doesn't it hurt them getting into college? Like, doesn't that keep them from going to these schools, these elite schools that they want to get into? And actually, the woman who was highlighting this said that they were actually a differentiator for them in the college application process, because every other student had a 4.2 or whatever, these insane GPAs. So they all looked the same on paper. But they didn't have anything to distinguish them. Their essays were all the same. And when they looked at the mastery transcript or their portfolio, they had all this different work that students were doing. They had, authentic service projects. They had, work that they were doing that mattered to show how they really met those progressions or master that standard. And so that was enlightening for a lot of people, that it doesn't hurt kids. It actually can help them by being able to show what they know and can do.
Yeah, I think we've been talking with Liberty Academy, which is a school that uses the mastery transcript for their high school students, and they're able to show their strengths, like you said, in different competencies, as well as holding that work. And there are a lot of schools that are using that as their transcript instead of traditional grades, as well as a lot of schools using it as a supplement to their transcript, as we kind of do this shift and work with higher ed and making sure that they are going to accept those transcripts. And then there's also schools like One Stone that they have a growth transcript that also does not have grades. So it's a different approach to doing a different transcript. And they've had a lot of success in getting students accepted to many universities across the country without traditional grades. There are some schools that are sending standards-based reports and report cards without traditional grades to universities. I think, I talked to one school leader and they said, well, when we talk to the universities, they said, we accept transcripts from all over the world, and people do grading and assessment and reporting in different ways all over the world. So if we can accept something from a different country, we can definitely accept from kids in our state that have a different looking transcript. So I think there is that myth and that fear of change, because it could mean we don't get our kids into college. I think there are a lot of systems that are really trying to be responsible about this shift and think about how can they use supplementary information. But there are also some that are really still responsibly, but like going to schools and saying like, hey, we're going to give a different transcript, and can we make sure our kids will still have the same opportunity to get into your university? And they're finding success with that too.
So we've just talked about a few examples, and you've kind of highlighted this as three different key shifts to competency based. So can you share kind of what those, for people who are like, it might be a little new or they're just wrapping their heads around, like, what are three of the shifts that you're really looking at when people are moving from a traditional system to more competency based systems?
Yeah, I think we've talked about one, which is from discrete content grade level standards to more of a progression or a continua of higher grain size, whole learner, still including those kind of academic skills, but in a less siloed course-based way and more in an interdisciplinary way, where students grow over time. I think that's one really big shift to competency-based assessment. The other big shift that we haven't really touched on, but was a huge part of my shifting in assessment, is really going from assessing assignments, giving grades on assignments, to assessing competencies. And assignments, if you will, like tests or quizzes or projects, those are just the vehicles in which students are giving their evidence towards those competencies. And it really opens your eyes in that paradigm shift to what assessment could mean. Anything could then be an assessment. An observation can be an assessment. Having a conversation with a student can be an assessment, because you're not grading the assignment. You are assessing the competency and the student's skill. I think that's a huge paradigm shift that is true in both a standards-based and a competency-based system.
And then the third one is
Yes. The third one. So the third shift is really, we talked about, we touched on this a little bit with mastery transcript and one stone, really trying to think about, instead of saying at the end of third grade, you are ready to go to fourth grade, or if you get all these course, you finish your English 9, English 10, 11, 12, you do 3 math, like these credits, that you actually are promoted to the next grade level, or you are graduating based on competency rather than seat time. And this, really moves away from the Carnegie unit and what it means to get a credit, and really talks about crediting based on competency. And that's really what the mastery transcript is all about. That's really what One Stone is trying to do in terms of really shifting towards where are students' strengths and where are their competencies, rather than, they've taken the courses that they need to take, they sat in the courses and they just got a maybe passing grade. I mean, I think it really like raises the bar on like saying, how do we really want students to show up, and when are they ready to move to the next level? When are they ready to graduate? Defining that, and then crediting based on that. So that's really more of a competency-based crediting model, that I think is a really big shift in this system. And there are some systems out there that are looking at what that could look like.
Yeah. Well, even Carnegie is really trying, you know what I mean, of the
Yeah.
Carnegie unit that has kept us locked in this box for over 100 years. They're starting to think about what does it mean to not just be focusing on seat time and that you showed up and you took this class, but really how do we open the walls of school and think about what's happening one beyond the school walls. Like kids are learning a lot in their work-based learning, their internships, projects, sports. There's a lot of things that young people are doing that they don't often get credit for, or they have to double up on. So really expanding the opportunities for crediting what kids know and can do beyond school. And then this idea of anytime, anywhere, that it's not just, on this day. And I think a lot of us were excited in the pandemic for a brief moment that it would allow some of those walls and barriers to be broken down. Uh, and we saw some, right? We saw some, but I do think this is a mind-bending shift for
Yes.
people who have been very locked into we have to grade on this day. And I like how you talked about it allows you to think differently about what an assignment is.
Mhm.
We If you talk to a student and they know something and they can talk about it, why doesn't that count? Why does it
Right.
have to be why does it have to be tested in a multiple choice scantron? If they know it, let's let that count, and let's give them that agency to show us how they can do something.
Right, or if they demonstrated it in their scouting experience or their home, there's a lot of things that kids are learning at home with their families, and how can they be demonstrating that? We didn't talk about that as one of the problems with traditional grading, but it is when you shift towards this learner-centered world and you're really doing authentic learning and anytime, anywhere learning, traditional grades just don't cut it in terms of giving the credit and assessing that learning. Whereas competency-based assessment really can open up that world of saying like, you know what, this is amazing that you did that, and we're going to give you credit for it, even though it didn't happen in a traditional test in our classroom.
Right. Well, even going back to your Spanish example at the beginning, right? Like you actually got the A because you were able to show it on a test, but weren't able to do it, in real time and have the conversation and demonstrate that competency. So for a really successful student, sometimes it's harder to move to this. And that's we get that push also, like, oh my gosh, my traditionally, typically high achieving students don't like it and because it forces you to be uncomfortable, but like, because you are a learner, you were like, oh, this is what I have to do to be successful. I'm gonna do what I have to do to become fluent in the language. And I think it would, as you said, raise the bar for so many of our kids
Yeah.
and create more opportunities for success for many kids.
Yeah, and that's the hope, and that's what I've seen possible in a lot of these systems that I've been talking to, is really great impacts on learners that are struggling in the current system, but also learners that are successful, that could be learning in a different way too.
All right. There's so much more we could go into. I have a
Well,
feeling.
and the playbook will go into some more details as we continue to talk to schools and continue to work on that in the coming months.
Well, and I'll be curious to get input for those listening. Like, what resonated? What questions do you have? What else do you want to know from Bryanna? We're happy to do this again, and would love to kind of see what people want to know, and also what examples other people have. Right? We know there's tons of examples that we can also learn from and highlight. So until next time, let's jump in and do rapid fire.
Okay.
So, what is one thing we should stop doing?
Uh, we should stop. So many things. We should stop. We should stop. Focusing on, here is your 9 out of 10 on this quiz, and really think about what is the actual outcome that we're assessing, and how can we give feedback on that rather than points on completion.
Great. What's one thing we should start doing?
We should really start examining why we are assessing the way that we're assessing, and really start thinking about what it is that we really want. What are those kind of hidden messages that we're giving students in our current grading practices? What are the things that we value, and how can we rethink our assessment practices to show that we value those things?
What should we keep doing?
We should keep, we as educators care a lot about our kids, and we should keep caring about them. And I think that any shifts that you make is all in the vein that you care about your kids, and you've always cared about your kids, and you've cared about their learning. And I think, we keep doing our best. When we know better, we do better.
I love it. What is one thing that you're focusing on learning right now? I think we know the answer, but
Well, yeah, I'm pretty deep into assessment and all things grading, and so that's been really fun to do the research and talk to a lot of people. It's been a really fun adventure.
what's one thing that many people might not know about you?
That's a good question. I grew up in the military. My family was in the military and moved around a lot, and so I currently live in California, but I've lived around the country and around the world, and I think that's really, shaped who I am in a lot of ways too.
What is your favorite quote or saying?
Oh, this is so funny. I actually was asked this on a check-in in a call recently, and I am terrible at remembering quotes or sayings. So this is what I gave as my favorite saying right now is my 2-year-old daughter's saying, "Thank you, mommy." And then she follows it with, "You're welcome, mommy," because I say you're welcome. And so she's learned that you say, "Thank you, you're welcome." So not
Oh,
a great educational quote, but it's currently my favorite saying. So
I love it. Sweet Peyton. Anything from her. What are you grateful for right now?
I'm grateful for a lot of things. But I think one is just the time and space that I've had to work on this project is I think, to be able to talk to so many people who are doing assessment in different ways. I'm grateful for the amount of time that they have gone into rethinking things and doing things differently. And then grateful for the opportunity to get to talk to them and highlight their stories, because I think it's something that is really invisible right now. People don't know what other people are doing. And so I'm really grateful to get to be the person that's gotten to talk to all of them and gets to highlight what they're doing in this playbook that we're working on.
I love that. And I'm grateful that you get to and that we get to talk about it. All right. Final question. What is your hope for the future of education?
Ooh, that's a big one. Um, I really hope that we can figure out a way at scale for public education to be more focused on real authentic learning and on what would help students be better humans and live better lives. I think that we are stuck in a paradigm that we created over 100 years ago, and it's really hard to get out of that. And I think there are systems that have shown a lot of success. And how do we make sure that every kid has that opportunity. That's my hope.
Thank you, Brianna.
Thank
So
you.
grateful for you and for this time together and excited for the playbook to come out.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.